Hi guys, in this video we're going to discuss Taiwanese independence and the possibility of Chinese invasion. The opening salvo of the new Cold War has been fired. The last few months has been marked by continued escalation between China and Taiwan, with Chinese jet fighters flying over the skies of Taiwan, while Taiwan continues to buy billions of dollars of military equipment from the United States. With an escalating conflict and rising pro-independence sentiment, how realistic is the possibility of Taiwanese independence or a Chinese invasion? How did we come to this situation? And what role does the international community have to play? Let's find out in this video. Just before we start, don't forget to subscribe for more political analysis videos and hit that bell notification while you're at it. Two Chinas. Now you might be asking why I'm using terms like Taiwanese nationalism or Taiwanese independence. Surely Taiwan is already an independent nation? And the answer to that is yes and no. As most of you already know, the Taiwan conflict originated from the Chinese Civil War. After the defeat of the nationalist Kuomintang by forces loyal to the Chinese Communist Party, the nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek and about 2 million of his soldiers and supporters fled to the Chinese island of Taiwan. Despite losing the war, the nationalists still claimed to be the legitimate government of the Republic of China, and were recognized as such by most Western nations. Tensions between the so-called Republic of China on Taiwan, the ROC, and the People's Republic of China on the mainland, the PRC, led Taiwan to form an alliance with the United States. But by the 70s, things began to change. President Nixon normalized relations with the PRC. In 1971, the PRC took over China's seat at the UN, and in 1979, the US recognized the PRC as a legitimate government of China, at the expense of the ROC government in Taiwan. But to compensate, the US government passed the Taiwan Relations Act, which allowed for arms sales to Taiwan, as well as adopting a policy of strategic ambiguity, where the US government leaves it up in the air whether the US will come to Taiwan's defense. And so in the year 2020, just 15 countries have diplomatic relations with Taiwan, and while the country is independent in practice, it remains unrecognized as the government of China. Its relations with the mainland have also evolved, which is critical to understanding this conflict. Until the 1990s, Taiwan was a right-wing military dictatorship under the leadership of the nationalist Kuomintang Party. The Kuomintang was strictly against advocating for Taiwanese independence and tried to suppress Taiwanese identity, favoring reunification with China under its leadership. But this began to crumble. In 1992, Taiwan held its first democratic legislative elections, which were followed by the first democratic presidential election in 1996. Relations with China began to improve, and restrictions on travel and trade were lifted, with China shifting its position from advocating for militant reunification to peaceful reunification. But the opening up of the democratic space also led to the rise of the left-wing Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP, which supported independence. This led to increased tensions with China, and China threatened Taiwan with missiles in 1996 in order to scare Taiwanese voters into not voting for the DPP. Although the DPP lost that election, when it came to power in the year 2000, China began adopting a more aggressive stance. In 2005, China adopted a law making secession illegal under pain of military action. This means that a declaration of independence by Taiwan would most likely trigger a Chinese invasion. But when the Kuomintang came back to power in 2008, relations with China began to improve again. And this is a consistent pattern in Taiwanese politics. Every time the DPP is in power, China is more aggressive, but when the Kuomintang is in power, China is more friendly. I think you can guess which party is in power right now. This is because of something called the 1992 Consensus. Basically, in 1992, the Chinese government and the Kuomintang-led Taiwanese government came to an understanding that there is only one China, with Taiwan as a part of China, but with different interpretations on who the legitimate government of China is. This implicitly suggests that Taiwan should not seek independence. Now, this consensus is accepted by the Kuomintang and until recently China, but not by the DPP. And so after the Kuomintang came to power, Taiwan and China signed the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement in 2010 to expand trade between the two countries, and in 2014 was the first ever joint meeting between leaders of the two nations. This trade has been increasing since the 1990s and is worth $200 billion and has benefited both sides economically. However, it is an asymmetrical trade relationship. Taiwan exports far more to China than it imports, but China is Taiwan's largest trading partner, while Taiwan is only China's sixth largest trading partner. So while both countries benefit, clearly Taiwan has more to lose from deteriorating trade relationships, which gives China more leverage. But even as trade relations improved, political tensions worsened with the election of a left-wing pro-independence DPP president, Tsai Ing-wen, in 2016. Tsai Ing-wen rejected the 1992 consensus, and Beijing responded by declaring a new consensus. Xi Jinping unilaterally declared Taiwan to be under the one country, two systems model of Hong Kong. And so what we see is two contradictory trends in Taiwan-China relations: increasing economic integration, but also increasing political escalation. And this raises the question, what are the prospects of a Chinese invasion and a Hong Kong-style takeover? The new Hong Kong. As most of you know, democracy in Hong Kong was crushed when China forced several legislators to resign, leading to mass resignations by pro-democracy legislators. This represented an acceleration of China's timetable, which had allowed for one country, two systems to continue until 2047. Some fear that the same could happen to Taiwan. Since Tsai Ing-wen was elected, China has continued flying planes over Taiwanese airspace, launched military exercises that simulate an invasion of Taiwan, and has continued to diplomatically isolate the country, excluding it from important international organizations like the WHO, even in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic, and has forced airline companies not to recognize Taiwan as an international destination, but rather as a Chinese province. What could tip these provocations into open war? The key trend to look at is China's growing military advantage. As China's economy grows, so does its military spending. And while Taiwan tries to keep up, a tiny nation of 23 million people can never hope to outmatch a superpower of 1.3 billion. On top of that, military spending in Taiwan has been stagnating, and since conscription ended, it has had difficulty finding military recruits. This gives China increasing leverage to force Taiwan into a position that is closer to unification. There are three scenarios that could trigger war. One is if Taiwan crosses a Chinese red line, such as declaring independence. As I said earlier, China's 2005 law makes secession illegal, and China reserves the right for itself to use military action. Another scenario is pessimism. If public opinion trends in Taiwan continue to change in such a way that independence becomes inevitable, then China may calculate that a preemptive strike is needed to prevent Taiwan's permanent separation. A third scenario is by accident. Continuous drills in the Taiwan Strait by the Chinese military, as well as American patrol ships sailing through the strait, could easily lead to an accidental firing or shooting down of a plane or ship, leading one side to believe that an all-out attack is imminent, triggering war. But there are also factors that could moderate or escalate these scenarios. Increasing economic integration between the two countries increases the opportunity costs of war, making it less likely. However, the costs of war are much higher for Taiwan than for China. Yet any attempt by China to force Taiwan into some kind of agreement that limits its sovereignty, like the one country, two systems model of Hong Kong, would be politically very difficult for any Taiwanese leader to sign, as it would be met by massive domestic political opposition, would undermine Taiwan's negotiating power in the future, and reduce the possibility of US intervention on the side of Taiwan, Because if Taiwan gives up its sovereignty, US intervention would mean intervention in China's internal affairs. However, for now, the US has stepped up its commitment to Taiwan's defense. Under Trump, the US has sold billions of dollars in weapons to Taiwan, and Trump broke the decades-long policy of US presidents not speaking directly to the Taiwanese president. Similarly, Joe Biden was among the first to congratulate Tsai Ing-wen on her re-election victory in 2020. The more China provokes Taiwan, the more it risks worsening its relationship with the United States and opens up the possibility of sanctions were any kind of invasion to take place. The goal of China through all these provocations is to both intimidate the Taiwanese into accepting more Chinese influence and to weaken and test the strength of Taiwanese military forces. Every time China violates Taiwanese airspace, Taiwanese fighters have to scramble, which both wears out Taiwanese planes and allows the Chinese to test their response times. Yet China's attempts to manipulate and intimidate the Taiwanese public have only backfired. A Taiwanese nation. Both Taiwan and China are ethnically similar, with the majority of the population being Han Chinese. Yet despite cultural similarities, the national identity of the two countries is growing apart. Since Taiwan became a democracy, Taiwanese have increasingly begun to see themselves as a distinct people with different social and political values. While China is still ruled by a one-party dictatorship, Taiwan is a free and liberal society and the first country in Asia to legalize gay marriage. The shifting norms and identity of Taiwan are also reflected in its politics. The Kuomintang, which long ruled Taiwan, was traditionally supported by those who descended from those who came to Taiwan after 1949, and older people, and has close ties to big business who favors strong relations with China. The DPP, on the other hand, is supported by those who lived on Taiwan before 1949, who were marginalized during the Kuomintang dictatorship, and favors independence. But as more and more Taiwanese have begun identifying as Taiwanese, and pro-independence and anti-China sentiment has increased, the Kuomintang has become less relevant, while the pro-independence DPP has become more popular. And Chinese interference to reverse these trends has only backfired. In 1995, the Chinese launched military drills after President Lee Teng-hui visited the United States, which caused those identifying as Taiwanese to jump from just 25% to 34%. Similarly, in 2019, Xi Jinping unilaterally declared that Taiwan was now under the one country, two systems arrangement, like Hong Kong, which led to those identifying as Taiwanese to jump from 54% to 67%, the highest it has ever been. And Chinese interference in the 2020 elections through a disinformation campaign also led to a landslide victory for Tsai Ing-wen. But even without Chinese intervention, the trends are clear. 2/3 of Taiwanese people now identify as Taiwanese, as opposed to Chinese or even both Chinese and Taiwanese. But identifying as Taiwanese does not necessarily translate into being pro-independence. The Taiwanese people are fairly pragmatic on this issue. 52.3% of the population support the status quo. If you add up those who support maintaining the status quo but moving toward independence and those who want immediate independence, it's just 35.1%, while those who support reunification add up to just 7.5%, with just 0.7% supporting immediate reunification. But even here, the trend is clear. More and more Taiwanese support independence, but for now, the majority support maintaining the status quo because they fear a declaration of independence would trigger a war with China. So Tsai Ing-wen has had to moderate her own party's pro-independence position to reflect that. However, she still rejects the 1992 consensus and therefore leaves the door open for independence. Sovereignty or democracy? The situation in Taiwan is complicated by two mutually exclusive truths. From a legal historical standpoint, Taiwan belongs to China. China has legal sovereignty over the island. At the same time, Taiwan belongs to its people, and they should have a say in who rules their country, and they don't want China. They increasingly see themselves as Taiwanese, not Chinese, and their democratic and liberal values make them different from mainland Chinese despite ethnic similarities. Both these things are true, but they are fundamentally irreconcilable with each other. If we go for path 1, it would mean a Hong Kong-style annexation with one country, two systems, which the Taiwanese would never accept. If we go for path 2, it would mean Taiwan declaring full independence, which the Chinese would never accept. But in this regard, I have to favor position 2. Democracy and the right to self-determination are more important than the legal claims of a one-party state. We should support Taiwan. Taiwan is one of the few places in the world where US foreign policy would actually do good. All too often, US interventions in the name of democracy have only made things worse and primarily serve US interests and often end up propping up dictators. But in this case, both American geopolitical interests and democracy are aligned. But there is a smart way to go about this. Increased US support for Taiwan would be seen as inflammatory, and while it would strengthen Taiwan's position, it would worsen the US-China relationship, making the Chinese more willing to take risks as they have less to lose from deteriorating relations with the United States. The key here is to support Taiwan in the diplomatic arena and militarily without supporting provocative acts like outright declaring independence. Recently, the US passed the Taiwan Invasion Prevention Act, which grants an authorization for the use of military force to the US president in the event of a Chinese attack on Taiwan. Similarly, more and more European countries, like the Czech Republic, are forming closer relations with Taiwan in the wake of the coronavirus crisis. Make no mistake, China is expanding, and Taiwan is just on the front line. To learn about the ongoing conflict in Ethiopia, check out my last video. Thank you to my Patreons for making this video possible. Like, share, and subscribe, because this was my take.